My sister stood up at our Thanksgiving table, raised her crystal glass, and proudly announced that our father had secretly given her the multi-million-dollar company I built from the ground up. She smiled right at me, relishing the moment, and declared that I was getting absolutely nothing. The entire room went dead silent. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a slow sip of my vodka, looked directly at my father, who was suddenly refusing to meet my eyes, and asked, "Should I tell them now, or do you want to do the honors?" My name is Sienna, 33 years old, and I am the founder of a high-end organic cosmetics brand. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who tried to take advantage of your hard work. Growing up, I was always the scapegoat, the daughter whose achievements were either ignored or claimed by someone else. But I learned early on that the best revenge is not an emotional argument. It is an airtight legal strategy. I hosted Thanksgiving dinner this year at my sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The house is a beautiful stone property with cathedral ceilings, a massive chef kitchen, and a formal dining room that looks out over the ocean. My family has always assumed I just rent this place. They think I share it with roommates just to afford the monthly lease. They have never bothered to ask for the truth, and I never volunteered it. It fit their narrative perfectly to imagine me struggling financially. To them, I was still just the stubborn older sister who made lip gloss and lotion in her kitchen, barely scraping by. They had absolutely no idea I bought this $3 million property entirely in cash 2 years ago, safely tucked under a private trust. The long mahogany dining table was covered in fine china and silver platters of roasted turkey, artisan stuffing, and expensive wine that I had carefully selected and paid for. The warm light from the crystal chandelier made the room feel cozy, but the energy around the table was entirely different. My younger sister Amber, who is 30 years old, sat directly across from me. Amber is the golden child. She has always been incredibly entitled, materialistic, and is constantly bailed out by our parents whenever she maxes out her credit cards. Beside her sat her husband Trey, a 34-year-old African-American man who confidently calls himself a finance expert. In reality, Trey recently bankrupted his own cryptocurrency fund and has been desperately looking for a cash cow to fund his lavish lifestyle. My parents, Richard and Diane, sat at opposite ends of the table. My mother, Diane, was already getting teary-eyed with pride, just looking at Amber, while my father, Richard, puffed out his chest with that familiar manipulative authority he always carried. We were just finishing the main course when Amber picked up her heavy silver spoon and began tapping it against her champagne flute. The sharp clinking sound cut right through the soft jazz music playing in the background. Everyone stopped eating and turned their attention to her. Amber stood up slowly, smoothing down her expensive silk maternity dress. She looked around the table, soaking in the attention she so desperately craved, before her eyes finally locked onto mine. Her expression was a mix of fake pity and pure smug triumph. She announced that she had a massive life-changing surprise to share with the family. With a sickeningly sweet voice, Amber declared that our father Richard had just finalized some very important legal paperwork. She reached into her designer bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and proudly proclaimed that he had legally transferred 100% ownership of Sienna Botanicals, LLC, into her and Trey's names. She called it an early Christmas gift from Dad, a generous way to support their upcoming baby and secure their financial future forever. Trey leaned back in his leather chair, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket, with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He crossed his arms and looked at me like I was a dismissed employee. He puffed out his chest and loudly added that they were thrilled to take the reins of the business. He actually had the nerve to say that under his brilliant financial management, they were going to turn my little hobby into a real corporate empire. My mother gasped in absolute delight, clapping her hands together. She reached over to squeeze Amber's hand, telling her how much she deserved this incredible blessing. My father just sat there, swirling his wine glass, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He acted like a generous king who had just bestowed a kingdom upon his favorite heir. None of them seemed to care that the kingdom they were celebrating was built with my blood, sweat, and tears. They sat in my home drinking my wine, celebrating the brazen theft of my life's work right to my face. They thought they had finally won. I silently looked at Trey. He was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He took a sip of his wine, swirling it around before setting it down with a heavy thud. He actually had the audacity to adjust his tie and clear his throat, commanding the room as if giving a speech at a shareholder meeting. "Look, Sienna," Trey said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We know this is a big transition for you. You have been running the day-to-day operations and we appreciate the groundwork you laid. But let us be honest, you do not have the vision to scale this. You are thinking small. Boutiques. Local pop-ups. I am thinking global distribution. I have the network to take Sienna Botanicals public within 2 years." I just stared right at him. The man who recently lost his investors millions in a crypto scheme was lecturing me about global distribution. However, Trey continued pacing behind Amber's chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. "We value loyalty. Amber and I discussed it, and we are willing to keep you on payroll. We need someone who knows the inventory. If you are willing to learn your place and respect the new chain of command, we can offer you a position as the warehouse manager. You would get a stable salary, decent benefits, and you would not have to worry about the heavy burden of decision-making anymore." Amber chimed in, nodding vigorously. "It is a generous offer, Sienna. You really should take it. You have always preferred being behind the scenes anyway." The sheer delusion in the room was suffocating. They were offering me a demotion in my own company, a business generating tens of millions in revenue, as if throwing a bone to a starving dog. I finally broke my silence. I set my napkin down on the table, keeping my voice perfectly level. "A warehouse manager. How thoughtful of you, Trey. But I think there is a slight misunderstanding here about how ownership works. You cannot just gift a company like a sweater. I built Sienna Botanicals. My name is on the brand." My father slammed his hand flat against the dining table, making the silverware rattle. His face flushed red, the polite mask dropping instantly to reveal the aggressive, domineering man I had known my entire life. "Do not play dumb with me, young lady," Richard snapped, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "You know exactly how the paperwork was filed. You were 17 years old when you started mixing those little potions in the kitchen. 17. A minor. You could not legally open a commercial bank account. You could not sign a binding vendor contract. Who do you think signed all those initial incorporation documents I did?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a toxic mix of pride and resentment. "I was listed as the legal custodian and the primary owner of the limited liability company. It was my name on the line. And let us not forget where the money came from to buy your first batch of bulk ingredients and packaging. I gave you $5,000 from the family savings account. I funded your little startup. You gave me $5,000 that I paid back with interest within 6 months," I replied calmly, not breaking eye contact. "And I did all the work. The formulas, the branding, the late nights packing boxes on the living room floor." "Paying it back does not change the equity structure," Richard countered, his voice booming through the dining room. "Seed capital is seed capital. Without my money and my signature, you would have had nothing. By the letter of the law, Sienna Botanicals LLC belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. I let you run it because it kept you busy, but it is my asset. And as the legal owner, I have every right to transfer my asset to anyone I choose." He gestured broadly toward Amber and Trey. "Your sister is bringing a child into this world. She needs stability. Trey is ready to step up and lead a real enterprise. You have been hoarding the profits for yourself for years, living in this ridiculous, overpriced rental, refusing to help your own blood. Well, I am correcting that mistake today. The company is theirs now. The paperwork is already filed with the state. It is legally done." The dining room fell completely silent again. My own mother looked away, pretending to be deeply interested in her glass, while Amber and Trey beamed with triumph. They truly believed that my father's signature on a dusty document from 15 years ago gave them the keys to my kingdom. They thought the trap had closed, unaware that I had built the cage myself. I watched my father lean back in his chair, crossing his arms like a judge who had just delivered a final, undeniable verdict. He looked so incredibly proud of the ambush he had orchestrated. Before I could even respond to his legal threats, my mother decided it was time to play her favorite role, the peacemaker who somehow always ended up making me the villain. Diane dramatically dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a linen napkin. She reached across the table, her voice trembling with forced emotion. "Sienna, sweetheart, please try to understand where we are coming from," she pleaded, wearing an expression of deep, exaggerated sorrow. "We are family. You have always been the strong one, the independent one. You just need to be the bigger person right now. Amber is pregnant. She is bringing our first grandchild into the world, and she has been under so much terrible stress lately." My mother let out a heavy sigh, shifting her gaze toward Trey, completely ignoring the sharp glare he was giving her. "Trey has had a terrible run of bad luck," Diane continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as if she were sharing a tragic secret. "That cryptocurrency fund he was managing went completely under last month. They lost absolutely everything. Their savings are completely wiped out. They are drowning Sienna. They desperately need the company revenue to survive and keep a roof over their heads." Trey's face instantly hardened, his arrogant facade slipping for a brief second. His jaw clenched tight as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It was unexpected market volatility, Diane." Trey snapped, clearly humiliated that his financial failure was being weaponized as a charity case. "I did not lose everything. It is a temporary liquidity issue. I am simply pivoting my portfolio into a more stable asset class, like retail cosmetics." I looked from Trey to my mother, feeling a cold, calm clarity wash over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their emotional chaos. I just let the silence stretch for a moment, forcing them to sit in the pathetic reality of their own words. "Let me make sure I understand this," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like glass. "Because Trey gambled away his investors' money on a failed crypto scheme, I am supposed to hand over the business I built from scratch to act as a financial life raft for a man who just insulted me in my own dining room." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "How can you be so incredibly cold? We are talking about your sister's future." "Let us talk about the past 15 years, Mom," I fired back, leaning forward slightly. "Let us talk about what family support actually looks like in this house. I have not taken a single dime from you or Dad since the day I turned 18, not 1 cent. I have worked 80-hour weeks for over a decade. I missed holidays, I missed vacations, and I slept on concrete warehouse floors just to make sure my holiday orders shipped on time. I built my success through relentless, exhausting discipline." I turned my gaze to Amber, who was aggressively stabbing a piece of turkey with her fork, refusing to look at me. "Meanwhile," I continued, "you and Dad paid for Amber to drop out of 3 different private colleges because she simply could not decide on a major. When she wanted to launch a failed jewelry line, Dad wrote a check. And just last year you handed her a $100,000 down payment for her house. You have bankrolled her entire existence. And now you want to hand her my existence too." Amber finally snapped her head up, her face flushed with anger. "It is completely different, and you know it. I was trying to find myself. You always knew exactly what you wanted to do. It has always been so easy for you." "Easy," I repeated, almost laughing at the sheer absurdity of the word. "You think waking up at 4 in the morning to negotiate with overseas suppliers is easy. You think risking everything I had is easy." Diane reached out again, her voice adopting that sickly sweet tone of a disappointed parent. "Family sacrifices for each other, Sienna. Look around you. You are already so successful. You have this beautiful rental home. You clearly have plenty of money to spare. Why must you be so incredibly selfish when your sister is in need? Why can you not just be happy for her?" I looked at the 4 of them sitting around my table. The tears, the guilt trips, the constant expectation that I must shrink my life, so Amber could comfortably expand hers. It was the exact same toxic dynamic they had forced on me since childhood. But this time I was not a helpless teenager desperate for their approval. I was a grown woman holding all the cards. I let the heavy silence linger for a few more seconds, watching my family exchange confused glances. They were waiting for me to break down. They expected me to yell, to throw my linen napkin, to storm out of my own dining room in a fit of hysterical tears. That was the old Sienna. That was the teenager who used to desperately beg for their approval. But as I sat there looking at my father's smug face and Trey's arrogant posture, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated calm. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and carefully placed it back on the coaster. I turned my attention entirely to Trey. He shifted his weight, trying to maintain his intimidating stance, but I could see a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "So, Trey," I said, my voice smooth and professional, stripping away any trace of our toxic family dynamic. "Since you are stepping in as the new owner and chief executive of Sienna Botanicals, I assume you have done your due diligence. As a finance expert, you must have conducted a thorough review of the company records before allowing my father to transfer the liability into your name." Trey scoffed, rolling his shoulders defensively. "I have reviewed enough to know the margins are solid. It is a retail product line. Buy low, sell high. It is not rocket science, Sienna." "I see," I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table. "But have you actually reviewed the profit and loss statements for the last 3 quarters? Have you looked at the P&L to understand our operational burn rate? What about our supply chain logistics? Do you know the lead times for sourcing raw organic materials from our international vendors, or the strict penalty clauses in our fulfillment contracts if we miss a shipping deadline?" Amber rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out a loud groan. "Oh my God, Sienna, stop trying to use big business words to scare him. Trey managed millions of dollars for high-level clients. Your little lotion company is absolutely nothing compared to what he is used to handling on a daily basis." Trey held up a hand, playing the magnanimous leader, calming his wife. He looked down at me with a pitying smile, the exact kind of condescending smile you give a child who thinks they have done something impressive. "Amber is right," Trey chuckled, leaning his hip against the edge of the dining table. "You are overcomplicating this to make yourself feel indispensable. Let us be brutally honest here. Running a modern makeup brand is not some complex logistical puzzle. It is just posting aesthetic photos on Instagram, paying a few influencers to pretend they like it, and cashing the checks. The warehouse packs the boxes, the website processes the payments, and the money just rolls in. I will streamline your bloated operations in a week." I stared at him. I literally stared at a man who had zero understanding of manufacturing, zero understanding of international freight, and zero understanding of commercial liability, confidently explaining my own industry to me. It was breathtaking. His arrogance was not just offensive, it was his ultimate vulnerability. He had not looked at a single financial document. He had just blindly signed whatever paperwork my father put in front of him, blinded by the promise of easy money and the thrill of stealing from me. My father chimed in, pounding the table lightly with his fist to regain control of the room. "Enough talking. You heard the boy. The transition is happening tonight. You can either cooperate and hand over the administrative access smoothly, or we can do this the hard way with lawyers. But I promise you, Sienna, you will lose. The law is on my side." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled all evening. My mother looked slightly unnerved by it, shifting uncomfortably in her seat and exchanging a worried glance with Amber. "Lawyers will not be necessary, Dad," I said cheerfully. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting beside my chair and pulled out my iPad Pro. I woke the screen, tapped into my administrative dashboard, and pulled up the digital handover protocols. I placed the tablet flat on the table and slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Trey. "You are absolutely right," I said, my tone incredibly bright and accommodating. "Why fight it? You clearly have a brilliant vision for the brand, Trey." "And Dad?" Since you are the legal custodian who funded the original $5,000, it is only fair that you execute your rights. I pulled a digital stylus from the magnetic edge of the case and held it out to Trey. Here is the master access portal I instructed, pointing to the screen. If you sign right there on the digital line, it immediately transfers the primary banking authorizations, the vendor communication portals, and the liability acknowledgments directly to your email address. I will sign my formal resignation right below it. You can have it all, right now. The entire room was paralyzed. My mother's mouth fell open. Amber blinked rapidly, looking from me to the iPad as if it were a trap door. Even my father looked momentarily stunned by how easily I was capitulating. He had prepared for a massive screaming match, a brutal legal battle, a desperate plea for mercy. He had not prepared for me to simply hand over the keys to the kingdom. Trey, however, was too blinded by his own massive ego to see the danger. He grinned widely, snatching the stylus from my hand. "Smart girl," he muttered quickly, scribbling his digital signature across the screen. "Glad to see you finally understand your place." He hit the bright green confirm button. I smiled even wider. The trap was officially locked. The moment the confirmation screen flashed green, Trey tossed the stylus back onto the table as if he had just closed a massive corporate acquisition. He immediately pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he prepared to take absolute control. He did not waste a single second pretending to be gracious. "Right," Trey said, snapping his fingers in my direction to get my attention. "I need the master administrative passwords immediately. I want full access to the primary banking portals, the e-commerce dashboard, and the complete directory of our international vendor contacts. Send me the encrypted file with the raw material suppliers and the logistics routing numbers. I need to see the exact profit margins we are working with before the markets open on Monday." I nodded smoothly, pulling the iPad back toward me. I opened the security settings and began typing his email address into the primary ownership field. Amber clapped her hands together, practically bouncing in her seat. She leaned against Trey, resting her chin on his arm. "How much is in the operating account right now, Trey?" she asked, her eyes wide with greed. "We should pull out a dividend right away. We need to upgrade my car before the baby arrives, and we definitely need to book that trip to St. Bart's to celebrate our new acquisition." Trey wrapped an arm around her waist, kissing the side of her head. "Think bigger, baby," he bragged, his voice booming through my dining room. "We are not just buying cars. With my financial network, I am taking Sienna Botanicals public within the year. We will initiate a reverse merger or launch an initial public offering. Once we get the valuation up, we are buying a yacht. Not a little boat, a real vessel. We will dock it in Miami by next winter and host investor parties on the deck." I listened to his ridiculous fantasy while I systematically revoked my own access. I watched the progress bar on my screen fill up as I transferred the digital keys to a man who had absolutely no idea what he was unlocking. I confirmed the transfer of the limited liability company banking portal. I transferred the designated contact information for the state tax board. I even forwarded the automated email notifications to his personal account. "All done," I said, pushing the iPad away. "You should be receiving the authentication emails right now. You are officially the primary administrator of Sienna Botanicals, LLC." Trey looked down at his phone as a barrage of new emails flooded his inbox. He scrolled through them, a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction washing over his face. He actually laughed out loud, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed off the cathedral ceilings. Richard beamed with overwhelming pride. He raised his wine glass high in the air, his chest puffed out. He looked at Trey and Amber as if they were the greatest achievements of his life. "Now that is how you execute a business deal," Richard announced proudly. "A toast to Amber and Trey, the real business minds of this family. I always knew you two had the ruthless corporate instinct needed to survive in the real world. Sienna did a fine job getting the little project off the ground, but it takes true visionaries to build an empire. I am incredibly proud to pass the torch to people who actually understand the value of a dollar." Diane eagerly raised her glass to join the toast. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile of false sympathy. "Do not feel bad, Sienna," she said softly. You are a wonderful artisan. You make lovely lotions. But the business world is just too harsh and complicated for someone with your quiet personality. You should be relieved that Trey is taking this heavy burden off your shoulders. Now you can just relax and enjoy your simple life. I did not argue. I simply reached across the table, picked up the thick manila envelope my father had brought, and pulled out the physical documents. I uncapped my pen and signed my name on the formal resignation letter, relinquishing all my duties as an officer of the limited liability company. I signed the liability transfer waivers. I signed the banking authorization releases. I handed the entire stack of perfectly executed legal documents directly to my father. Richard snatched the papers from my hand, quickly scanning the signature lines to make sure I had not missed a single one. Satisfied, he slid them over to Trey, giving his son-in-law a firm nod of approval. The handover was complete. They had everything they demanded. They had the paperwork, the bank access, and the title. They were completely convinced they had just stolen a gold mine. They had no idea they had just willingly chained themselves to a sinking ship. With the documents securely in Trey's possession, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted from tense negotiation to arrogant celebration. Amber leaned back in her chair, resting her hands on her pregnant belly, and let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. She looked around my dining room, her eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings, the custom artwork, and the expensive hardwood floors with a look of undisguised disdain. "Sienna, we really need to talk about your living situation now," Amber said, her voice dripping with that fake maternal concern she had perfected over the years. "Now that you have formally resigned and have absolutely no income, you obviously cannot afford to keep the lease on this massive overpriced rental. It was always a ridiculous financial decision anyway, trying to live out here in the Hamptons, just to look successful to your little internet friends." I calmly picked up my fork and took a small bite of my artisan stuffing, letting her talk. I wanted her to put every ounce of her entitlement on full display. Trey and I were discussing it on the drive over here. Amber continued, completely oblivious to my silence. "Since we are going to be so incredibly busy running the company and preparing for the public offering, we are going to need reliable help at home. We have a finished basement in our house. It is not huge and it can get a little drafty in the winter, but it has a small bathroom. We are willing to let you move in there rent-free." Trey nodded enthusiastically, pointing his wine glass at me. "It is a win for everyone, Sienna. You get a free place to crash while you figure out your next minimum wage job, and in exchange, you can be our full-time live-in nanny. Amber is going to need round-the-clock support when the baby arrives, and we simply cannot trust strangers. You will be responsible for the night feeds, the laundry, and keeping the house pristine. Plus, it will be good for you to finally learn some domestic skills instead of pretending to be a corporate executive. You have been playing businesswoman for far too long. It is time to rejoin the real world." I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite interest. My younger sister, whose mortgage was heavily subsidized by my father, and her husband, who had just bankrupted his only legitimate business venture, were offering me a damp basement to live in. They genuinely believed they were doing me a massive favor by allowing me to become their unpaid servant. It was the ultimate manifestation of how they viewed me, not as a person, not as a successful entrepreneur, but as a resource to be consumed and discarded whenever it was convenient for them. My mother clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Oh, Amber, that is so incredibly generous of you," Diane gushed, reaching out to pat my sister's arm. "Do you see, Sienna? This is what real family does. We take care of each other. You have been so isolated and stressed out here, all by yourself, prioritizing your selfish career over everything else. Moving into the basement will give you a sense of purpose. You can help raise your niece or nephew, and you will not have to worry about paying rent or buying your own groceries. You can finally experience the joy of family life that you have been missing out on." I looked down at the expensive china plate in front of me, taking a deep, slow breath to keep my composure. It was almost beautiful how perfectly they had constructed this alternate reality. They had just stolen my life's work, stripped me of my supposed income, and yet they had somehow convinced themselves that they were my benevolent saviors. My father, entirely satisfied that he had restored the natural order of the family, stood up at the head of the table. He grabbed the heavy silver carving knife and the serving fork, driving the prongs deep into the center of the roasted turkey. He began slicing thick pieces of the premium organic bird I had specially ordered from a local farm, distributing the meat onto their plates with the grand sweeping gestures of a victorious patriarch. He spooned heaps of artisan stuffing and poured rich gravy over their portions, acting like the generous host of a feast he had absolutely no hand in creating. "Let us eat and celebrate," Richard announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "To new beginnings, to smart business moves, and to keeping the family wealth exactly where it belongs." They all raised their glasses, clinking them together in a unified cheer that deliberately excluded me. I watched them dig into the luxurious Thanksgiving feast I had prepared and paid for. I watched them pour more of my expensive vintage wine into their crystal glasses, laughing loudly and making grand plans for the millions of dollars they thought they were about to inherit. Amber was already scrolling on her phone, casually mentioning different luxury yacht models she wanted Trey to look into. As I sat there quietly sipping my water, my inner monologue was completely devoid of any anger, panic, or resentment. I felt no urge to defend my home, my accomplishments, or my bank account. Instead, I simply observed them like a scientist watching a fascinating slow-motion disaster. Every bite of food they took, every arrogant boast they made, was just another heavy chain binding them to their own destruction. They were gleefully celebrating their absolute ruin, completely oblivious to the massive legal landmine they had just willingly strapped to their own chests. The digital ink on those handover documents was already dry. The countdown to their financial devastation had officially started, and all I had to do was sit back, watch them eat my turkey, and wait for the clock to run out. I rested my elbows on the table, interlacing my fingers as I watched Trey aggressively slice through another piece of white meat. The dining room was filled with the sound of clinking silverware and my mother humming happily to the jazz music. Since they were so eager to play corporate executives, I decided it was the perfect time to ask a few basic operational questions, just to see how deep the delusion really went. I looked directly at Trey, keeping my expression perfectly pleasant. I asked him how he planned to handle the Q4 Sephora fulfillment. Trey stopped chewing. He glanced at me, a brief flash of confusion crossing his features, before his arrogant mask slid right back into place. He swallowed loudly and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "The Sephora fulfillment," I clarified, speaking slowly, as if addressing a toddler. "The holiday purchase orders are massive this year. Our main warehouse facility needs to ship out 40,000 units of the organic night serum by next Friday. The raw ingredients are highly volatile and require temperature-controlled logistics. If we miss the delivery window by even 24 hours, the retailer imposes a 15% penalty on the entire invoice. Have you coordinated with the freight forwarders yet?" Trey let out a loud, dismissive laugh, waving his hand in the air. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a false sense of supreme confidence. "Please, Sienna," he scoffed. "Do not try to overwhelm me with your little administrative details. You are acting like moving a few boxes of face cream is some kind of military operation." He looked around the table, making sure he had an audience before continuing his grandstanding. "I have high-level finance connections all over the East Coast," Trey bragged, tapping his temple. "I know guys who move international cargo shipments worth tens of millions of dollars. I will just make a quick phone call on Monday morning and have one of my supply chain specialists handle your little warehouse issue. It is a simple logistical pivot. We will probably even cut costs by outsourcing the packaging to a cheaper facility. You have been overpaying for temperature control anyway." Amber nodded along, completely mesmerized by his corporate buzzwords. "Exactly," she added, taking a sip of her sparkling water. "You always make things so unnecessarily complicated, Sienna. Trey knows how to delegate. That is what real leaders do. They do not stress over boxes." I did not bother correcting him. I did not bother explaining that our organic certifications would be instantly revoked if he moved the product to a cheaper non-compliant facility. I just let his ignorance hang in the air, a testament to his impending doom. Instead, I shifted my gaze down the table to my father. Richard was happily buttering a dinner roll, looking completely relaxed now that he had successfully dumped the company. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice low and serious. "Are you absolutely certain Trey is ready for this?" Richard paused, his butter knife hovering over his plate. He shot me a warning glare. "I just told you he is Sienna. Drop it." "I am not talking about the daily operations," I pressed, gently, making sure my words were loud enough for the entire table to hear. "I am talking about the legal and financial burden. Running an enterprise is not just about collecting revenue. It is about absorbing the risk. When you transferred the limited liability company to Trey and Amber, you also transferred all of its legal obligations. I just want to make sure you have fully prepared them for the liabilities of the LLC." I emphasized the word liabilities just enough to see a brief, panicked twitch in my father's right eye. For a split second, the smugness vanished from his face, replaced by the sheer terror of a man who knew exactly what he was hiding. He quickly looked down at his plate, refusing to meet my gaze. He slammed the butter knife down against the porcelain plate with a sharp clack. He pointed a finger directly at my face, his voice rising in anger. "Listen to me carefully," Richard snarled, dropping the benevolent patriarch act completely. "I am sick and tired of your endless jealousy. You cannot stand the fact that your sister is stepping up to take your place. You cannot stand that a real businessman like Trey is going to take this company to heights you could never reach." He leaned forward, his face flushed red. "There are no liabilities that Trey cannot handle. He is a financial professional. You are just trying to ruin this celebration because you are bitter." "You have always been bitter, Sienna. You are a difficult child and you are a difficult adult. Now sit there, finish your meal, and stop trying to undermine your sister's happiness with your pathetic scare tactics." My mother quickly chimed in, glaring at me with deep disappointment. "Really?" Sienna Diane scolded. "Can you not just let Amber have this one special night? Must you always try to be the smartest person in the room?" I held my hands up in a gesture of surrender, my face entirely neutral. I leaned back in my chair and picked up my glass of water. "You are right," I said smoothly. "I apologize. I will not mention the liabilities again." I took a sip of my drink, my eyes locked on the digital clock resting on the mantelpiece across the room. It was exactly 6:55. I only had to endure 5 more minutes of their insults before the automated banking system would deliver the reality check they so desperately deserved. Let them enjoy their turkey. The main course was about to be served. My mother wiped a small smudge of cranberry sauce from the corner of her mouth with her linen napkin and tapped her manicured fingernail against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound demanded the attention of the entire table. Diane stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her expensive cashmere sweater. She lifted her glass high, her eyes practically shining with overwhelming adoration as she looked down at Amber and Trey. "I want to propose a formal toast," Diane announced, her voice trembling slightly with manufactured emotion. "To my beautiful daughter Amber, who is going to be the most incredible mother, and to Trey, the brilliant new chief executive officer of our family empire." My father grunted, his hearty approval immediately raising his own glass. "Hear, hear." Diane continued pacing the length of the table with the theatrical flair of a woman who believed she was starring in her own movie. "For years, we have worried about the potential of this little business. We watched it stay stagnant, trapped in a small mindset, desperately waiting for someone with real vision and corporate expertise to take the helm. Today, that wait is finally over. Trey, we are so incredibly blessed to have your financial genius leading the way. And Amber, my sweet girl, you finally have the wealthy, stable future you have always deserved. To the new owners of Sienna Botanicals, may your success bring this family the prestige it has always been meant to achieve." "To the new owners," Trey echoed proudly, clinking his glass against Amber's. They all took a long celebratory drink. Not a single one of them looked at me. It was as if I had physically evaporated from the room the moment my father handed over those signed documents. The shift in their behavior was instantaneous and incredibly revealing. Now that they believed they had stripped me of my only valuable asset, I was no longer a threat. I was no longer an obstacle. I was simply the hired help occupying space in their grand celebration. Amber set her glass down and snapped her fingers in my direction without even turning her head. "Sienna," she said, her tone flat and completely dismissive. "Be useful and clear these appetizer plates, will you? And bring out the second bottle of the Bordeaux. Trey and I want to celebrate properly before we start outlining our executive strategies for Monday morning." I did not argue. I did not throw my plate at the wall. I calmly stood up, gathered their dirty salad plates, and stacked them neatly on my arm. I walked over to the mahogany credenza, retrieved the second bottle of expensive red wine I had purchased, and smoothly uncorked it. I walked back to the table and poured generous measures into my parents' glasses, then filled Trey and Amber's glasses right to the brim. "Thank you," Diane murmured dismissively, not making eye contact, already entirely engrossed in a conversation with Richard about which country club Trey should join now that he was a wealthy executive. I returned to my seat and simply watched them. The dining room was loud with their arrogant laughter and ridiculous fantasies. Trey was loudly explaining to my father how he planned to leverage the company inventory to secure a massive line of credit for his next real estate investment. Amber was showing my mother pictures of a ridiculously expensive nursery designer she planned to hire in the morning. They were completely intoxicated by their own greed. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my silk blouse and glanced down at my wristwatch. The sleek silver hands moved with quiet, relentless precision. It was currently 6:58 in the evening. Today was Thursday, the 25th of November, Thanksgiving Day. But in the corporate banking world, the 25th of every single month held a very different, much more significant meaning. It was the designated date for automated institutional debt collection. When you structure a commercial business loan of a certain magnitude, the bank does not wait for you to mail them a paper check. They do not send polite reminder emails. They require direct, unfettered access to the primary operating account of the designated limited liability company. And exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening Eastern Standard Time, the automated clearinghouse system initiates an irreversible sweep of the required funds. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep past the 12. 6:59. Trey laughed loudly at a joke my father made, leaning back and resting his hands behind his head. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world. He had absolutely no idea that the digital infrastructure of his newly acquired banking portal was currently waking up, verifying his fresh administrative credentials and preparing to execute its monthly protocol. I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady. The ambient jazz music swelled in the background. My mother laughed. Amber touched her stomach. Trey took another long drink of my expensive wine. 10 seconds left. 5 seconds. I stared directly at Trey's expensive smartphone, resting face up on the polished wooden table. I waited for the digital guillotine to drop. Exactly at 7 o'clock, the digital guillotine fell. Trey's expensive smartphone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany wood, the screen lighting up with a bright notification banner. The sudden buzzing sound cut sharply through the smooth jazz music and the loud, boastful laughter of my family. Because I had just transferred all the master administrative privileges over to him, his personal email was now directly linked to the primary banking portal of the limited liability company. Every single financial alert, every transaction receipt, and every automated banking trigger was now routed straight to the device sitting right next to his dinner plate. Trey paused in the middle of his grand story about leveraging real estate. He glanced down at the glowing screen, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He probably expected it to be a welcome email from the state tax board, or a generic confirmation message from the corporate domain registry. He picked up the phone with a lazy, arrogant flick of his wrist, his other hand still holding his crystal wine glass. He tapped the notification banner to open the full message, bringing the screen closer to his face. I watched him with absolute, unwavering focus. It is a rare and fascinating thing to witness the exact second a man's entire fabricated reality collapses. First, his eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. Then the arrogant, self-satisfied smirk that had been plastered across his face all evening completely vanished. His jaw went slack. The hand holding his expensive wine began to tremble ever so slightly, causing the dark red liquid to ripple inside the glass. He blinked hard aggressively, swiping down on his screen to refresh the email application, desperately hoping the numbers staring back at him were just a bizarre digital glitch. He tapped into the attached secure portal link, his thumb moving frantically now. The confident, booming finance expert from 2 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of absolute financial ruin. Amber noticed his sudden silence. She stopped talking to my mother about her ridiculously expensive nursery designer and frowned at him. "Trey, honey, what is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "Put the phone away. We are celebrating our new business. You can look at emails tomorrow." Trey did not answer her. He did not even look at her. His eyes were glued to the bright screen of his phone. He set his wine glass down on the table so hard that the crystal chimed loudly, nearly spilling the dark red liquid onto the white linen tablecloth. "What the hell is this?" Trey muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. My father froze. The piece of turkey he was about to eat stopped halfway to his mouth. Richard knew exactly what that notification was. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. "Speak up, Trey," my father demanded, trying to inject a false sense of authority into his suddenly shaking voice. "What are you looking at? If it is a vendor invoice, just ignore it until Monday." Trey finally looked up from his phone, his eyes darting frantically between my father and me. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the information displaying on his banking dashboard. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the edge of the dining table. "Why is there an auto draft of $150,000 pending from the operating account?" Trey asked, his voice cracking with rising panic. The dining room went completely silent. Even my mother stopped chewing her fork, suspended in midair, as the sheer size of the number registered in her mind. $150,000 was not a minor administrative fee. It was not a shipping penalty. It was a massive sum of money, and it was currently being automatically extracted from an account that Trey now legally owned. Trey looked directly at me, his eyes wide and pleading for an explanation. "Sienna, what is this? Did you schedule a massive vendor payout right before you handed over the credentials? Did you try to steal from the company accounts on your way out? Cancel it. Cancel the transaction right now." I calmly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to my plate. I looked at Trey, then shifted my gaze to my father, who was suddenly sweating profusely under the warm light of the crystal chandelier. "I did not schedule anything, Trey," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "I have absolutely no control over that account anymore. You changed the passwords yourself. That transaction is an automated institutional sweep. It happens on the 25th of every single month precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening." Trey shook his head, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "What do you mean an institutional sweep? What institution? For what?" I looked at him, feeling no pity whatsoever. "I think you should read the description attached to the pending transaction," I suggested simply. Trey practically shoved his face back into his phone. He read the tiny text beneath the massive deduction amount, his voice trembling, as he spoke the words aloud to the silent room. "SBA loan repayment, principal and interest." The words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Trey stared at his screen, his mind desperately trying to reject the information his eyes were transmitting. The notification banner glowed brightly, an unyielding digital witness to the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I reached for my crystal glass filled with vodka on the rocks. The ice clinked softly against the sides as I lifted it. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me in the absolute reality of the moment. I lowered the glass, my eyes shifting from Trey's horrified face to my father sitting frozen at the head of the table. Richard was gripping the edges of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner place the hood over his head. The proud, booming patriarch who had just toasted to his own brilliance was completely gone. I looked right at him, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure wash over me. Should I tell them now? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. Or do you want to do the honors, Dad? My father opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his throat working frantically, but his signature authority had completely evaporated. He tried to raise his hand to silence me, a pathetic, weak gesture that just made him look incredibly guilty. He could not look at Amber. He could not look at Trey. Trey slammed his hand flat against the table, making the fine china jump. What loan? He demanded, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. Sienna, look at me right now. What the hell is this loan? I turned my attention back to my new chief executive officer. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. It is exactly what it says it is. Trey, I explained calmly, maintaining the professional tone of a corporate advisor, delivering bad news. Sienna Botanicals, LLC, is currently carrying a massive commercial debt, specifically a $6 million business loan secured through the Small Business Administration. Amber gasped loudly, pressing both hands against her chest as if she had just been shot. $6 million, she repeated the number clearly too massive for her entitled mind to properly comprehend. She looked at Trey, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to tell her it was just a misunderstanding. But Trey was not laughing. Trey shook his head violently, his eyes wild with aggressive denial. No, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the tablet I had pushed across the table earlier. That is completely impossible. I did not see any debt schedules on the ownership transfer documents. I did not sign any commercial loan agreements tonight. You did not have to sign new loan agreements, I pointed out, leaning forward slightly to make sure he heard every single word. You signed a blanket assumption of liability when you formally took over the limited liability company. You did not ask to see the balance sheets. You did not ask for a list of active creditors or review the corporate credit profile. You just saw the word ownership and blindly rushed to sign your name before I could change my mind. When you accept an LLC Trey, you accept its assets and its debts. All of them. Trey looked like he was going to be physically sick. As a man who claimed to work in high-level finance, he knew exactly what an assumption of liability meant. He knew the inescapable legal trap he had just sprinted into with a giant smile on his face. And that notification you just received, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. That is the automated draft for the monthly principal and interest payment. $150,000, every single month. Automatically withdrawn on the 25th right around dinner time. That is the burn rate you just inherited. Diane finally found her voice, though it was barely a high-pitched squeak. But Sienna, the company revenue covers that, right? You are a successful brand. You just pay the loan with the profits from the makeup sales. I smiled at my mother, a cold, sharp smile. Trey did not share my mother's naive optimism. He stared at his phone, his breathing jagged and uneven. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the cold sweat that had suddenly broken out across his forehead. He understood the brutal math. $150,000 a month was an aggressive, suffocating repayment schedule. It was the kind of financial drain that could instantly sink a company if cash flow was disrupted for even a few days. You set me up, Trey whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of rage and sheer panic. You set me up to take the fall for this massive debt. I did not set you up to do anything, I replied smoothly. I simply sat here and watched you demand the keys to a burning building. You wanted the company. You insulted my intelligence. You offered me a job in my own warehouse and you laughed at me. I just gave you exactly what you aggressively demanded. Amber grabbed Trey's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Trey, she pleaded, her voice rising in absolute hysteria. What does this mean? We cannot afford to pay a bank $150,000 a month. Cancel the transfer. Give the company back to her right now. Trey looked at his wife with a hollow, devastated expression. He understood the legal reality of what they had just done far better than she did. The digital ink was already dry. The administrative authorizations were already processed by the state and the bank. We cannot just give it back. Amber Trey said, his voice completely defeated. The liability is already in our names. Trey was absolutely right. The liability was irrevocably tied to their names now. I watched my sister physically recoil from her husband, her hands dropping from his arm as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. She looked at our father, her eyes wide with desperate confusion. Dad, Amber pleaded, her voice cracking. Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you did not just trick us into taking on a $6 million debt. Richard opened his mouth, but he looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He could not form a single coherent sentence. He just kept wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead with his expensive linen napkin, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door as if calculating whether he could simply run away from the dining table. Since my father seems to have temporarily lost his booming executive voice, I will go ahead and fill in the blanks for everyone, I said. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick black folder I had prepared earlier this week. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I flipped it open, revealing a stack of high-quality printouts featuring the unmistakable letterhead of a major commercial lender. What you are looking at is the master loan origination file, I explained, tapping the top page. Exactly 3 years ago, my father realized that his name was still legally listed as the primary owner of Sienna Botanicals, LLC. He also realized that the company was generating massive gross revenue, so he went to a commercial bank, presented himself as the sole proprietor, and applied for a massive commercial expansion loan backed by the Small Business Administration. Trey leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the documents upside down. He approved $6 million, Trey whispered, absolutely horrified. How did you not know he pulled $6 million out of your own operating account? Because he did not put it in the operating account. Trey, I corrected him sharply. He set up a shadow account under the LLC umbrella, a completely separate ledger that I had absolutely no visibility into. The bank evaluated the company based on the tax returns, approved the funds, and wired the entire $6 million directly into his secret account. My mother clutched her chest, her face completely pale. Richard. Diane gasped, her voice trembling with genuine horror. What did you do with $6 million? We do not have that kind of money in our savings. We do not have anything close to that. I flipped to the second page in the binder, which consisted of detailed bank statements and wire transfer logs. I decided to read them out loud for the benefit of the entire room. Let us review the corporate expenditures of the former chief executive, I announced clearly. Within the first month of securing the loan, he wired $400,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A week later, another $200,000 went to a casino in Atlantic City. Over the next 2 years, he systematically drained millions of dollars to cover massive high-stakes gambling debts. He used my company as his own personal piggy bank to fund a secret gambling addiction. Richard finally found his voice. It was an investment, he croaked, his hands shaking violently. I had a system. I was going to double the money and put it all back before anyone even noticed. You bet $6 million on blackjack and horses? I fired back, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. You are not an investor, Dad. You are a degenerate gambler who stole from his own daughter. Trey grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages frantically. He stopped at a specific transaction line, his eyes widening. Wait a minute, Trey said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He pointed a shaking finger at a massive wire transfer. What is this withdrawal for $800,000? This did not go to a casino. This went to a real estate escrow account. I smiled, turning my attention to my sister, who was currently trying to make herself as small as possible in her chair. I am so glad you found that line item, Trey, I said brightly. That $800,000 went toward purchasing a luxury vacation home in Aspen, a beautiful ski out property, but the deed is not in my father's name. I paused for just a second, letting the tension peak. Dad bought that house under a private trust, I revealed, locking eyes with Amber. And the sole beneficiary of that trust is Amber. He used the commercial loan secured by my company to buy his golden child a secret mountain retreat. Trey slowly turned his head to look at his pregnant wife. The veins in his neck were bulging. He looked completely unhinged. You knew, Trey hissed, his voice lethal. You knew about the Aspen house. I swear I did not know where the money came from, Amber cried hysterically, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. Dad just told me it was an early inheritance. He said it was an investment property for the baby. I had no idea it was tied to Sienna's company. It is not tied to my company anymore, Amber, I reminded her cheerfully. It is tied to your company. You and Trey currently owe the bank $6 million for a loan that funded your own vacation home and your father's gambling addiction. And as of tonight, the grace period is officially over. The words hung heavily in the dead air of the dining room. I let the reality of that final sentence sink into their minds. What do you mean the grace period is over? Trey asked, his voice barely a whisper. I closed the black folder and folded my hands neatly on top of it. I looked directly at my father, who was suddenly refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. He was staring at his half-eaten plate of turkey, as if it held the secrets to the universe. Did you honestly think he woke up this morning overflowing with holiday generosity? I asked Trey, gesturing toward my father. Did you really believe that a man who has controlled every single financial aspect of this family for decades suddenly decided to hand over a multi-million-dollar enterprise just out of the goodness of his heart? Let me explain the exact timing of this beautiful Thanksgiving miracle. I turned my attention to my mother, who was sitting completely frozen, gripping her crystal wine glass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. For the past 12 months, my father has been fighting a losing battle with the commercial lender. I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. He missed 3 consecutive monthly payments earlier this year. The bank threatened to accelerate the loan and demand the entire $6 million balance immediately. Desperate to avoid absolute ruin, he begged for a temporary forbearance agreement, a period of leniency to restructure his finances and get the payments back on track. My father squeezed his eyes shut. He knew exactly what I was about to say next. The bank granted him that forbearance, I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the large room. But that forbearance agreement has a strict expiration date. It ends next Tuesday. On December 1st, the bank is legally authorized to begin aggressive collection protocols. They were preparing to seize his primary residence, freeze his personal brokerage accounts, and liquidate everything he owns to satisfy the massive debt he accumulated through his gambling addiction. I paused, letting my gaze drift to Amber. She was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. So he needed a way out, I said smoothly. He needed someone else to hold the bag. He could not sell the limited liability company to a legitimate buyer because a standard corporate audit would instantly reveal the $6 million debt and the missing cash. No real investor would touch it. He needed a buyer who was incredibly greedy, painfully arrogant, and entirely too eager to sign the transfer papers without doing a single shred of basic financial due diligence. I looked right at Trey. He needed you, Trey. He transferred the limited liability company into your name today, right before the long holiday weekend, because it was his absolute last chance to legally dump the financial liability onto someone else before the bank came for his own house. You are not the new chief executive officer. You are the sacrificial lamb. A sharp, shattering sound exploded in the dining room. My mother had dropped her crystal wine glass. It smashed into dozens of pieces against the hardwood floor, sending a dark red puddle of expensive Bordeaux splashing across the pristine rug. She did not even seem to notice the mess. She just stared at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "Richard," Diane whispered, her voice shaking violently. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not just trick our pregnant daughter into taking on your massive gambling debts to save yourself." Amber suddenly let out a sharp gasp. Her hands flew to her chest, her breathing turning into rapid, shallow pants. She pushed herself away from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I cannot breathe!" She choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Trey, I cannot breathe. We cannot owe $6 million. We just bought the new house. The baby is coming. We are going to lose everything." She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving uncontrollably as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal crashed down on her. The golden child, the daughter who had been protected and coddled her entire life, had just been served up on a silver platter by the very father she idolized. Richard jumped up from his chair, his face flushed a deep, angry purple. He slammed both hands down on the table, trying desperately to reclaim his booming authority. "Everyone needs to calm down right now," Richard shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. "Sienna is intentionally twisting the facts to scare you. Yes, there is a loan. Yes, I made some bad investments, but the business is highly profitable. You all know how much product she sells. The holiday orders alone bring in millions." He pointed a shaking finger at Trey. "You are a finance man, Trey. You know how to manage cash flow. The revenue from the makeup sales will easily cover the monthly payments. You just use the company income to pay the bank and you keep the rest. It is a completely standard corporate debt structure. Sienna is just furious because she is out of a job and she wants to ruin our night. Do not let her manipulate you. The company makes more than enough money to handle this." Trey looked at my father, his eyes practically bulging out of his head. He looked like he wanted to leap across the table and strangle the older man. But before Trey could unleash his fury, I reached into my leather bag one final time. My father was right about one thing: the company revenue was massive. But he was about to learn a very painful lesson about corporate structure. Trey suddenly stopped pacing. The sheer panic that had gripped him just moments ago seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden manic surge of adrenaline. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of financial supremacy, and his ego absolutely refused to let him be the victim of a bad deal. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his breathing slowing down as his mind frantically grasped onto my father's desperate justification. "You know what Trey said," his voice rising, regaining that arrogant edge that had irritated me all evening. He pointed a finger at me. "Your father is right. You are just trying to scare us because you are out of the game. $6 million sounds like a lot to a small-minded girl who used to mix lotion in her kitchen. But in the real corporate world, $6 million of leveraged debt is absolutely nothing." Amber looked up at him, her mascara-streaked cheeks pale and trembling. "What are you talking about, Trey?" she cried. "It is $6 million. We do not have it. We do not need to have it in cash." "Amber." Trey snapped, clearly annoyed that his own wife could not keep up with his supposed genius. He turned to face the entire room, spreading his arms wide as if delivering a keynote speech at an investor conference. "Do the math. Sienna just admitted her company generates massive revenue. Industry experts value the Sienna Botanicals brand at roughly $50 million based on its current market share and exclusive retailer contracts." He began pacing again, but this time with the confident swagger of a Wall Street shark closing a hostile takeover. "So we inherited a $6 million liability. Big deal. We also inherited a $50 million asset. You take the $50 million, subtract the $6 million debt, and that still leaves us with a net equity of $44 million. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the massive number registered. $44 million. Diane whispered, her eyes darting between my father and Trey. "Richard, is that true?" My father quickly nodded, grabbing onto Trey's logic like a drowning man clutching a life raft. Exactly. My father agreed, his booming voice returning. The brand is a gold mine. The debt is just a minor operational cost. I told you Trey knew what he was doing. Trey let out a loud, mocking laugh, looking down at me with absolute triumph. Did you really think you could outsmart me, Sienna? He sneered. Did you think a little commercial loan would send me running? You just gave me a multi-million-dollar payday. I am not even going to bother running your warehouse. I am not going to deal with logistics or holiday shipping penalties. I am just going to flip the entire enterprise. I will sell Sienna Botanicals to a private equity firm, pay off your father's little debt, and Amber and I will walk away with $44 million in pure profit by Christmas. He pulled his phone back out of his pocket, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. You do not believe me. Watch this, Trey commanded the room. I have a major contact at a top-tier private equity firm in Manhattan. They acquire high-growth cosmetic brands all the time. I am going to call him right now, put him on speakerphone, and we will start the acquisition process tonight. Nobody moved. My parents watched him with breathless anticipation, their hopes entirely pinned on this arrogant man's contacts. Amber sniffled, sitting up a little straighter in her chair, the dollar signs clearly flashing back into her eyes. Trey tapped the screen and placed the phone flat in the center of the mahogany dining table. He hit the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly in the silent room. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Finally, a deep professional voice answered the line. This is David. David, my man, Trey shouted enthusiastically, leaning over the table. It is Trey. Listen, I have an incredible opportunity for your firm, and I wanted to give you the first look before I take it to the open market. I just acquired full ownership and controlling interest of Sienna Botanicals, LLC, the organic skincare line. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Sienna Botanicals. The broker asked, his tone suddenly shifting to sharp professional interest. The brand with the exclusive Sephora distribution contracts. That is the one, Trey boasted, shooting a triumphant glare in my direction. I am looking to initiate a fast cash buyout. The brand is easily valued at $50 million. I am willing to fast-track an acquisition for your firm if we can start the paperwork on Monday. I sat back in my chair, picked up my vodka, and took another slow sip. Trey had perfectly set the stage. He had built his fantasy castle high in the sky, completely unaware that he had built it on quicksand. The broker on the phone was about to give him a brutal education in corporate acquisitions, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The broker's voice echoed through the speakerphone, sharp and incredibly amused. Mr. Sterling, I just ran the corporate registry search you requested. I am not sure who gave you this tip, but you are looking at a ghost. Trey leaned closer to the phone, his smug smile faltering instantly. Check again. Sienna Botanicals, LLC. She just signed a massive distribution deal. I have the press release right here in my hand. A harsh chuckle crackled over the line. I do not need to check again. Sienna Botanicals, LLC is an active entity, yes, but it is purely an operating shell. It holds 0 assets, 0 intellectual property, 0 real estate. Its current valuation is essentially the cost of the state filing fee. You are trying to leverage a hollow cardboard box, buddy. Call me back when you have something real to sell. I reached across the turkey platter and tapped the red button on Trey's phone, ending the call abruptly. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy with the scent of roasted sage and sudden crushing defeat. Trey stared at the blank screen of his phone, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. I did not give him time to recover his fabricated confidence. I reached into my tote bag resting by my chair, pulled out a massive leather-bound legal binder stamped with the red seal of the state of Delaware, and slammed it down right in the center of the Thanksgiving table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. You really thought I would make it that easy? I asked, my voice deadly calm. You thought I would build a multi-million-dollar empire and leave it sitting in a single unprotected LLC where any greedy family member with a forged power of attorney could snatch it. My mother. Eleanor recovered her voice first. her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. Sienna, what is the meaning of this? Why is your brother being humiliated by some broker on Thanksgiving? Trey humiliated himself. Mom, I replied, gesturing to the heavy binder. He tried to sell my company out from under me to cover his own massive debts. He just found out he stole the wrong paperwork from my home office. Trey slammed his fist on the table, knocking over his water glass. Where is it? Where is the real company, Sienna? You owe this family. I owe you nothing. I shot back, leaning forward so he could see the absolute conviction in my eyes. I learned my lesson 10 years ago when you drained my college savings account to buy that ridiculous sports car. And Mom and Dad called it an early inheritance advance for their golden boy. I realized then that if I ever built anything of value, I had to bury it so deep, none of you could ever touch it. I flipped open the heavy binder, the crisp pages turning with a sharp snap. Sienna Botanicals LLC is just the public face. It leases the manufacturing equipment from SB Holdings. It licenses the formulas and patents from Aurora Innovations, and the physical real estate that is owned by a blind trust registered in Wyoming. I am the sole beneficiary and managing director of all of them. You cannot touch a single cent. My father stood up, throwing his linen napkin onto his plate. This is incredibly selfish, Sienna. Your brother is in serious trouble. His investment firm is threatening to seize his assets. We are talking about his home, his children's future. You have all this hidden wealth, and you are playing games with holding companies instead of helping your own blood. He is not in trouble because of bad luck, Dad, I countered, refusing to back down from his glare. He is in trouble because he embezzled client funds to support a lifestyle he could not afford. You want me to liquidate my life's work to pay off his criminal mistakes? It was a temporary cash flow issue, Trey shouted, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled. I was going to put the money back. If you just sign over the IP rights to me, I can secure a bridge loan by Monday. You can afford to lose one division of your little skincare brand. My little skincare brand is currently valued at $45 million, I stated clearly, watching the blood drain completely from my parents' faces. And I am not signing over a single jar of moisturizer to save you from federal prison. Eleanor grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. You will do as you are told. We gave you everything. We raised you. If you do not transfer those patents to your brother right now, I will ensure you are dead to this family. We will ruin your reputation in this city. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The threat of being cast out used to terrify me. Now it was exactly what I wanted. You cannot ruin my reputation, Mom, because I do not operate in your shallow country club circles, I said. But speaking of ruining reputations and losing homes, there is one more detail in this binder you should probably see. I flipped to the very last tab in the Delaware file and pulled out a single notarized document, placing it right on top of the ruined turkey. Trey was not just looking for a bridge loan, I announced, watching my brother's eyes widen in absolute terror. He already took one out 3 months ago. And you will never guess what he used as collateral. He used a forged assignment of ownership for Sienna Botanicals LLC. I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the dining room like a scalpel. He pledged my company to a private equity firm in Chicago, a firm notorious for hostile takeovers and aggressive asset seizures. The only problem for Trey is that he pledged a phantom. He handed them a piece of paper that legally entitles them to absolutely nothing. Trey slumped back into his mahogany dining chair. His face was the color of wet ash. He stared blindly at the notarized document resting on the carcass of the Thanksgiving turkey. My father leaned forward, his brow deeply furrowed in genuine confusion. I do not understand any of this, Sienna. You just told us your brand is worth $45 million. You have products in major retail stores across the country. How can you say he pledged nothing? Because, Dad, I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table. Sienna Botanicals LLC is merely a distributor. It is a vendor. It does not own a single drop of the products it sells. It is time for a quick lesson in corporate law, something I spent years studying while Trey was busy failing out of his expensive business fraternity. I stood up feeling the immense weight of the past decade finally lifting off my shoulders. I began to pace slowly behind my chair, commanding the room effortlessly. When I was 18 years old, you two decided to empty my college savings account. You handed my future over to Trey so he could buy a sports car he crashed 3 months later. You told me it was a necessary family sacrifice. You told me I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. And you were right. I did figure it out. But the lesson I learned was not about hard work or family loyalty. The lesson was that my own blood would financially ruin me if it benefited their golden boy. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but the sheer venom in my gaze silenced her instantly. So at 18, while working 3 jobs to pay for community college, I spent every free hour in the campus law library. I continued. I learned about asset protection. I learned about corporate veils. And before I ever mixed my first batch of serum in my tiny kitchen, I filed the paperwork to form a Delaware C Corp. I named it Sienna Holdings. Trey buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic groan escaped his throat. He worked in finance. He knew exactly what a Delaware C Corp meant. My parents, however, were still struggling to catch up to the reality of the situation. A Delaware C Corp, I explained, looking directly at my father, offers the strongest corporate shield in the world. It provides absolute privacy and impenetrable asset protection. Nobody knows who owns it unless I want them to. And more importantly, nobody can pierce that veil to take what is mine. Sienna Holdings is the true powerhouse. It is the absolute fortress that houses my entire empire. I meticulously assigned every single piece of intellectual property I ever generated directly into that corporate entity. I walked back to the table and tapped the heavy binder for emphasis. Every single organic cosmetic formula I ever created, from the vitamin C serums to the overnight masks, belongs entirely to the C Corp. The proprietary extraction method for our blue tansy oil, the exact chemical stabilizers that make our products last longer than any competitor on the market, belongs to the C Corp. The trademarks for the brand name, the logo, the specific designs of our packaging, it all resides safely locked inside Sienna Holdings. I paused, letting the reality of my structural masterpiece sink deep into their minds. And that massive exclusive distribution contract with Sephora that made headline news last month? I asked, a bitter smile touching my lips. The one that guarantees prime shelf space in over 800 stores nationwide. The one Trey thought he was selling to the highest bidder today. That contract is exclusively negotiated and held by Sienna Holdings. Sienna Botanicals, LLC, simply executes the shipping logistics. If Trey's private equity friends try to seize the LLC, all they will get is a stack of empty cardboard boxes and a leased warehouse space in New Jersey. They get zero intellectual property. They get zero revenue streams. My father's face went completely pale. He looked from me to Trey, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Trey, my father whispered, his voice trembling. If you pledged assets you did not actually own to a private equity firm to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, that is not just a bad business deal. That is wire fraud. That is a federal crime. I nodded slowly, locking eyes with my brother. Exactly. Trey forged my signature to claim he had controlling interest in the LLC. Then he presented the LLC to the lenders as the sole owner of my patents and Sephora contracts. He committed felony fraud to secure millions, which he immediately dumped into his failing investment fund to hide his embezzlement. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure horror. Sienna, you have to fix this. You have to transfer the patents to the LLC right now. If you do not, your brother will go to federal prison. They will arrest him. I looked down at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard clarity. I will not move a single asset, I said firmly. I spent 10 years building an empire from the dirt up, specifically designing it so that none of you could ever steal it. I built an impenetrable fortress, Mom. And I am not lowering the drawbridge just because the wolf you raised is finally at your door. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. The only sound in the dining room was the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds to my brother's inevitable ruin. Trey looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. "But the LLC still has value," he stammered, desperation bleeding into his voice. "It has the warehouses. It has the employee contracts. It has the physical inventory. The private equity firm will take that and liquidate it. It might not cover the whole loan, but it will be something. They can still operate the distribution side." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the crystal chandelier above us. "You really have no idea how a modern supply chain works, do you?" I asked, walking slowly back to my seat. I did not sit down. I simply rested my hands on the high back of the chair, looking down at the man who had tormented me for years. "Let me clarify exactly what Sienna Botanicals LLC is," I said, making sure every word was razor-sharp and perfectly enunciated. "It is not an independent entity with its own operational autonomy. It is a glorified third-party vendor. A middleman. My Delaware C Corp Sienna Holdings hired that LLC exclusively to manage the physical bottling, labeling, and shipping of the products. That is it." I watched my father's eyes widen as he finally grasped the mechanical reality of my business structure. "The LLC does not own the warehouses, Trey." I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. "It leases them from a commercial real estate firm on a month-to-month basis. The employees, they are hired through a temporary staffing agency. The LLC does not even own the forklifts or the conveyor belts. Those are rented. And as for the physical inventory, the serums, the creams, the raw materials." I leaned forward, locking my gaze with his terrified eyes. "The LLC does not own those either. The inventory remains the exclusive property of Sienna Holdings until the exact moment it is scanned at a retail register or delivered to a customer's doorstep. The LLC simply holds it in trust. If your private equity friends try to seize the warehouse contents tomorrow, they will be stealing property directly from my C Corp, and my corporate attorneys will file a massive theft and conversion lawsuit against them before lunchtime." Trey's hands began to shake violently. He knocked over his wine glass, sending a pool of dark red Cabernet seeping into the pristine white linen tablecloth like a spreading wound. He did not even try to clean it up. "But the vendor contract," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The LLC has the exclusive vendor contract to distribute the products. That contract has to be worth millions. They can sell the rights to that contract to another logistics company." That was the moment I had been waiting for. The final fatal blow to his arrogant, parasitic existence. I reached into the front pocket of my tote bag and pulled out a crisp single sheet of heavy bond paper. It was folded neatly in thirds. I walked around the table and stopped right beside Trey's chair. I dropped the paper onto his empty dinner plate. "Pick it up," I commanded. His trembling fingers fumbled with the paper as he unfolded it. His eyes darted across the black text, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "What is this?" my mother demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Sienna, what did you just give him?" "Read it out loud, Trey," I said, ignoring her completely. "Read it to the family." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was physically incapable of speaking the words that cemented his doom. "Fine. I will do it," I said, taking the paper back from his limp hands. I cleared my throat, adopting a cold, professional tone. "To whom it may concern. This letter serves as formal legal notice that Sienna Holdings Incorporated is exercising its right to invoke the termination clause outlined in Section 4, Paragraph B of the Master Vendor Agreement with Sienna Botanicals, LLC. I paused, letting the legal jargon hang heavy in the air. "As per the terms of our contract," I continued, "any unapproved change in ownership, controlling interest, or the pledging of the LLC as collateral to an outside entity constitutes a material breach of trust." Therefore, as of 5 p.m. today, my C Corp has terminated its vendor contract with your LLC due to change of ownership. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, signaling the bottom of the hour. It sounded like a death knell. Your LLC is dead. Trey, I stated, dropping the paper back onto his plate. It has no contracts, it has no inventory, it has no assets. It is an empty shell with a massive loan attached to it. You handed that private equity firm a worthless piece of paper, and by Tuesday morning, they are going to realize you defrauded them out of millions. My father slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect Thanksgiving dinner completely destroyed. And Trey just sat there staring at the termination notice, his entire world crumbling into dust. Amber, who had been sitting rigidly beside Trey this entire time, finally snatched the termination notice from his limp hands. Her perfectly lined eyes scanned the document rapidly, her jaw dropping as she reached the bottom. She looked from the paper to Trey, then to the massive Delaware binder sitting next to the ruined turkey. $6 million, she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden rising panic. Trey, you told me we were securing a bridge loan against a $50 million asset. You told me we were buying out your sister's distribution network to save your firm. What does she mean the LLC is an empty shell? Trey could not look at her. He stared blankly at the dark wine stains spreading across the pristine white tablecloth. Answer me, Amber shrieked, slamming her hand flat on the table, making the remaining silverware jump. Did you or did you not sign a personal guarantee for a $6 million loan from Vanguard Equity? He finally nodded, a slow, agonizing movement of his head. Amber let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. A personal guarantee. That means they can take our house. They can take the cars, the vacation fund, the kids' college accounts. We do not own a cosmetics empire, Trey. We own a warehouse lease in New Jersey and $6 million in immediate, unforgivable debt. The gravity of her words hung in the dining room, suffocating whatever oxygen was left. The grand illusion of their immense wealth, built entirely on embezzlement and fraud, had just evaporated into thin air. Suddenly, Trey's head snapped up. His eyes, previously glazed over with pure shock, locked onto Richard, Amber's father. Richard was sitting quietly at the far end of the table, his face a mask of cold, detached calculation. Richard had always been the mastermind in Trey's eyes, the ruthless venture capitalist who had supposedly taken my brother under his wing. This was your firm, Trey said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, accusatory growl. Vanguard Equity. They are your old golfing buddies, Richard. You set up the introduction. You pushed me to use them for the bridge loan. Richard wiped his mouth calmly with his linen napkin and set it down next to his plate. I introduced you to a capital source, Trey. I did not tell you to commit wire fraud to secure the funds. I assumed, as any seasoned investor would, that you actually owned the underlying assets you were pledging. You knew, Trey shouted, surging to his feet so fast his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the floor. You reviewed the LLC paperwork with me. You told me it was a brilliant maneuver. You said Sienna was a naive girl who left her flank exposed, and that seizing control of the LLC would effectively give me control of the entire brand. You orchestrated this whole thing to get a piece of her company. I gave you strategic advice based on the fabricated documents you provided me. Richard shot back, his patrician voice rising to match Trey's sheer volume. You brought me the fake assignment of ownership. You assured me she had bundled the intellectual property into the LLC. It is not my fault you are too incompetent to understand the difference between a holding company and a vendor shell. You got outplayed by a 28-year-old girl, and now you want to blame me for your monumental stupidity. Amber stood up quickly, stepping between her husband and her father. Dad, how could you let him sign a personal guarantee? You knew Vanguard's reputation. They are absolute sharks. They are liquidators. They destroy families for sport. I protected my own interests, Amber, Richard said, coldly adjusting his cuffs. Vanguard required collateral. Your husband was desperate to cover the massive hole in his investment fund before the SEC caught wind of his embezzlement. He made his bed and now he has to lie in it. Trey lunged forward, grabbing Richard by the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater. I will drag you down with me. If I go to federal prison for fraud, I am telling the feds you masterminded the entire corporate takeover. You advised me on every step of the forgery. Get your hands off me, you pathetic failure, Richard roared, shoving Trey backward with surprising force. Trey stumbled, his arms flailing, and crashed hard into the antique serving buffet behind him. A heavy silver tray and a stack of bone china plates clattered to the hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. My mother screamed, clutching my father's arm. Stop it! Both of you stop it right now. This is our family Thanksgiving. There is no family left here. Eleanor. Richard sneered, smoothing his ruined collar. Your son is a criminal, facing a federal indictment, and he has just bankrupted my daughter in the process. Amber, go upstairs and get the children right now. We are leaving. You will file for emergency divorce and a full asset separation first thing Monday morning. Trey looked at his wife, sheer desperation pleading in his eyes. Amber, please. We can fix this. I can hire lawyers. We can fight them. With what money? Amber spat angry tears, ruining her immaculate makeup. You lost everything. You pledged our entire life on a lie. I am not letting my children grow up on the street because you wanted to play corporate raider with your sister's company. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the dining room, calling sharply for the kids. Richard followed right behind her, not casting a single backward glance at the ruins of the family he had just helped destroy. I stood quietly at my place at the table, watching the Golden family tear each other to shreds. They were vicious, greedy, and utterly self-serving. The moment the money disappeared, so did their absolute loyalty. My mother was weeping hysterically into her hands, and my father was staring blankly at the shattered china on the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Trey was left standing alone amidst the wreckage of his life, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. The heavy silence was abruptly broken by the scraping of a wooden chair. Diane, my mother, who had just been weeping hysterically, suddenly stood up. The fragile, overwhelmed facade vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic clawing desperation. She stumbled around the shattered china on the hardwood floor, ignoring the sharp porcelain entirely, and lunged toward me. Before I could react, her hands clamped onto my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her sharp manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of my silk blouse. Sienna, you have to stop this right now, Diane pleaded, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, terrifying edge. You have proved your point. You are smart. You are successful. We all see it now. But you have to reinstate that vendor contract. You have to call your lawyers and fix the holding company paperwork before Monday morning. I stared down at her hands gripping my arm, feeling a visceral wave of absolute disgust. I did not move. I just looked at her coldly. Fix his felony fraud, Mom, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely even. It was a mistake, she cried, shaking my arm slightly as tears streamed down her perfectly powdered face. A desperate mistake. Sienna Amber is pregnant. She just found out last week. They are having their third child. If Vanguard Equity calls in that loan, Trey will go to federal prison. Amber will be a single mother with absolutely nothing. The scandal will completely destroy our family name in this city. You cannot let your own brother be locked in a cage. You cannot ruin your future nephew's life over a simple business dispute. There it was, the ultimate trump card. The classic psychological gaslighting maneuver she had perfected over 3 decades. She was weaponizing guilt, family obligation, and the sudden, highly convenient revelation of a pregnancy to force my immediate compliance. She wanted me to fold, just like I had always done when we were kids. I slowly reached up and peeled her fingers off my arm, one by one. I took a deliberate step backward, putting significant physical space between us. I made sure I was completely out of her reach, establishing a boundary that was both physically and emotionally untouchable. A simple business dispute, I repeated the absolute absurdity of her words echoing in the ruined dining room. Mom, he forged my signature on federal documents. He stole my corporate identity. He tried to sell my entire life's work to a private equity firm to cover up the fact that he embezzled money from his own clients. That is not a dispute. That is a string of severe federal crimes. And you are standing here ankle deep in shattered dinner plates demanding I become an accomplice to wire fraud just to protect your golden boy. I am asking you to have a heart. Diane shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure desperation. We are your parents. We gave you life. We are blood. And then you spent the next 28 years making sure I knew I was second best. I shot back, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. Let us talk about having a heart, Diane. Where was your heart when I was working graveyard shifts at a downtown diner to pay for my community college textbooks, while you bought Trey a brand new Rolex for his graduation? Where was your heart when I came to you with my very first business plan, asking for a simple $10,000 loan, and you laughed in my face? You told me to get a safe receptionist job because I did not possess the intellect for business. Diane flinched backward, as if I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I refused to let her control the narrative for one more second. You built this monster, Mom, I said, pointing directly at Trey, who was still staring blankly at the wall, paralyzed by shock. You and Dad shielded him from every single consequence of his actions since the day he was born. When he crashed cars, you bought new ones. When he failed his university classes, Dad bribed the alumni board. When he blew through his entire trust fund, you drained my college savings to cover his gambling debts. You taught him that the rules do not apply to him. You taught him that there will always be a financial safety net, usually woven entirely from my sacrifices. My father tried to interject, raising a trembling hand from his seat. Sienna, please. Be reasonable. We were just trying to be supportive parents. You were terrible parents, I stated flatly, my icy gaze sweeping over both of them. You created a dependent, entitled parasite who firmly believes he can forge legal documents and steal millions without consequence. And now, the real world has finally caught up to him. Vanguard Equity is not going to accept a tearful apology from his mother. The federal prosecutors do not care about Amber's new pregnancy. Diane collapsed back into her dining chair, burying her face in her arms. She began sobbing with a deep, wretched sound that shook her entire frame. You are a monster, she wailed into the ruined tablecloth. You are cold and utterly ruthless. I am exactly what you forced me to become, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of empathy. I had to become ruthless to survive in this house. I had to build an impenetrable corporate fortress because the very people who were supposed to protect me were the ones actively trying to tear me apart. I picked up the heavy Delaware corporate binder from the table and slid it carefully back into my leather tote bag. I zipped it shut with a sharp final snap. I am not your financial shield anymore, I said, looking at the three of them one last time. I will not sign over a single patent. I will not reinstate that vendor contract. I will not pay a single dime of his criminal defense fees. When the FBI knocks on your door next week, do not bother calling me. Trey's head snapped toward me, his bloodshot eyes wide with fresh absolute terror. The FBI? What do you mean? My corporate lawyers have already compiled a full dossier of your forged documents, I stated, picking up my coat from the back of the chair. We sent it to the authorities this morning to preemptively protect Sienna Holdings from your mess. Happy Thanksgiving, Trey. You finally got exactly what you earned. Before I could even slip my arms into the sleeves of my coat, Amber burst back into the dining room. Her face was streaked with ruined mascara, and her two young children were trailing behind her, looking utterly bewildered. She had clearly been eavesdropping from the grand foyer and heard the mention of federal authorities. Her father, Richard, was nowhere to be seen, having apparently made good on his threat to abandon the sinking ship. Amber marched right up to me, her chest heaving with manic energy. You think you can just pack up your little bag and leave? She screamed, her voice shrill enough to make the crystal chandelier vibrate. We are losing our home because of your selfish games. Vanguard is going to foreclose on our house by the end of the month. If the bank throws us out onto the street, we are moving into your apartment. We will pack up the kids and stay in your little downtown rental until you fix this holding company mess and clear Trey's name. You owe us a roof over our heads. I stopped mid-motion, letting my cashmere coat slide off my shoulders and back onto the chair. I looked at Amber, then at my brother, and finally at my parents, who were watching this exchange with a mix of horror and sudden, desperate hope. They actually believed Amber's demand was a viable solution. They still viewed me as the subservient daughter who could be bullied into providing shelter and resources on demand. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled all evening. My apartment. I asked, the amusement clear in my voice. Amber, do you honestly believe I live in a rental apartment? Of course you do. My mother snapped, her tear-stained face twisting into a scowl. You told us you were leasing a small place in the city. You said you only rented this house for the long weekend, so we could have a proper Thanksgiving dinner together. I reached back into my leather tote bag. The Delaware binder was safely tucked away, but there was one more document resting at the very bottom. A document I had brought specifically for this inevitable moment. I pulled out a thick, heavy stock folder embossed with the seal of the county clerk's office. I lied, Mom, I said simply. I lied because I knew if I told you the truth, you and Dad would immediately demand to move in or expect me to host your extravagant country club parties or use my property as collateral for Trey's endless financial black holes. I opened the folder and extracted a certified property deed, holding it up so the gold seal caught the light. I do not rent an apartment, I stated, locking eyes with Amber, whose arrogant expression was rapidly dissolving into confusion. And I did not rent this house for the weekend. I bought this entire estate 2 years ago. I paid $3 million for it in cash. It is legally owned by the Wyoming Blind Trust I mentioned earlier, which means my name is not on any public registry. That is why Trey could not find any real estate assets when he tried to sell me out. The silence that fell over the room this time was entirely different. It was the silence of absolute crushing defeat. My parents looked around the massive, elegantly appointed dining room as if seeing it for the very first time. They looked at the custom wainscoting, the imported marble fireplace, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds. The reality that I owned all of it free and clear while their golden boy was facing federal prison and bankruptcy finally shattered their delusions. You cannot move into my apartment, Amber. I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, authoritative command. Because I live right here, and I do not allow criminals or parasites in my home. Trey let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. Sienna, you cannot kick us out. We have nowhere to go. Richard took the car. We are stranded. You can call an Uber, I replied, pulling my smartphone out of my pocket and tapping the screen to wake it up. Or you can walk. I truly do not care, but you are no longer welcome on my property. My father stood up, his face flushed with indignity. You are throwing your own family out onto the street on Thanksgiving. Have you lost your mind? We are your parents. You lost the right to call yourselves my parents the moment you cheered for my destruction, I fired back, stepping toward the head of the table. I am giving all of you exactly 10 minutes to gather your belongings and walk out my front door. If anyone is still standing inside my house or on my driveway at the end of those 10 minutes, I will call the local police precinct and have you all arrested for criminal trespassing. Sienna. Please, my mother wailed, reaching out toward me again. 10 minutes, Mom. I interrupted sharply, raising my phone. The clock starts right now. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the grand foyer, leaving them scrambling in the ruins of the dining room. I could hear the immediate chaotic sounds of panic breaking out behind me. Amber was frantically pulling her crying children toward the coat closet, shrieking at Trey to help her. My father was loudly berating my mother for pushing me too far, while Diane continued to sob hysterically, completely paralyzed by the sudden brutal shift in power. They were finally experiencing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty, and I was finally taking my space back. I reached the grand foyer, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Just as I was about to open the hall closet to retrieve my coat, the heavy oak front door violently swung open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Richard stormed back, inside his face a mottled, furious purple. The cold November wind whipped through the open doorway behind him. He marched directly toward me, completely ignoring Amber and the children who were cowering near the staircase. "Open the main gate right now, you petulant child," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger inches from my face. "I tried to drive off the property, but your security gates require a manual exit code. You are unlawfully detaining me. I will add false imprisonment to the massive lawsuit I am going to file against you on Monday morning." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, looking at the man who had orchestrated my brother's attempt to steal my life's work. "You are not going to sue anyone, Richard," I said calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. "You are going to go back to your country club and try to figure out how to salvage your own reputation. When the federal investigators start asking why your private equity friends accepted forged documents." Richard took another step forward, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. "I will sue you for breach of contract, for tortious interference, and for emotional distress." He snarled, saliva flying from his lips. "I have a team of corporate litigators who will tie your little holding company up in court for the next decade. We will drain every single cent you have in legal fees until you are begging us to settle. You think you won this little game? I will destroy you." The rest of the family had spilled out of the dining room and into the foyer, drawn by Richard's aggressive shouting. My father looked absolutely terrified, while Trey was still hyperventilating, leaning against the archway for support. I slowly raised my phone, making sure the screen was visible to everyone in the room. The 10-minute timer I had set earlier was still counting down, but that was not the only app I had open. "You are completely out of your depth, Richard," I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think I am playing a game. I am securing my borders." I tapped the screen, once bringing up my active call log. When I handed Trey that vendor termination notice 15 minutes ago, I did not just sit there waiting for your predictable temper tantrums, I explained, looking around the foyer at the faces of my stunned family. I quietly pressed the panic button installed under the dining room table. It is directly linked to my private estate security firm and the local police precinct. I informed them I had hostile trespassers on my property who were refusing to leave. Richard's jaw dropped. "You called the police?" He stammered, the aggressive bluster instantly vanishing from his voice. "On your own family." Before I could even answer, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway pierced the tense silence. Red and blue lights began flashing through the frosted glass panels of the front door, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the marble floor of the foyer. Right on cue, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Two loud, authoritative knocks hammered against the open doorframe. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the entryway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They were immediately followed by two towering men in tactical gear, with the logo of my private security firm emblazoned on their chests. "Ms. Wilson," the lead officer asked, stepping forward and assessing the chaotic scene. "We received a panic alarm and a report of aggressive trespassers refusing to vacate the premises." "Are you safe?" "I am perfectly safe, officer," I replied, gesturing toward the group huddled in the center of my foyer. "But these individuals have been asked to leave my property multiple times, and the gentleman in the cashmere sweater was just threatening me with physical and legal retaliation." The officer turned his stern gaze onto Richard, who suddenly looked very small and incredibly old. "Sir," the officer commanded, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate, "you need to step away from the homeowner immediately." "This is a family dispute," my father protested weakly, stepping forward with his hands raised. "It is Thanksgiving. We are just having a disagreement. This is private property, and the owner has asked you to leave," the second officer stated, pulling out a small notepad. "Gather your belongings. You are all being escorted off the premises right now. If any of you cause a scene or refuse to comply, you will spend your Thanksgiving night in a holding cell." The absolute humiliation that washed over my family was palpable. The Golden family, the people who cared more about their social standing and country club appearances than anything else in the world, were being publicly evicted by armed police officers. Amber began sobbing uncontrollably, grabbing her children's coats with shaking hands. Diane could not even walk straight. My father had to physically support her as they fumbled in the closet for their expensive jackets. Trey moved like a zombie, staring blankly ahead as a security guard directed him toward the door. Richard did not say another word. He grabbed his coat, shot me one last look of pure, unadulterated venom, and marched out the door, escorted closely by an officer. I stood quietly in my beautiful, peaceful foyer, watching them all file out into the freezing November night. The flashing police lights illuminated their faces, capturing the exact moment their arrogant empire finally crumbled into dust. They had tried to steal everything I built, and instead they had lost absolutely everything they had. The lead officer turned to me before closing the door. "We will make sure they are completely off the estate. Have a good evening." "Thank you, officer," I replied softly. "I definitely will." The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the freezing November draft outside. I stood in the quiet foyer for a brief moment before walking slowly into the darkened, formal living room. I did not turn on the lights. Instead, I approached the massive bay windows that overlooked the expansive circular driveway and the wrought iron front gates of my estate. The private security vehicles and the police cruisers were idling near the entrance, casting rhythmic, frantic flashes of red and blue across the manicured, frost-covered lawns. The sheer chaos unfolding on the driveway was a masterpiece I had waited 10 years to witness. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched the ultimate payoff play out in real time. Richard was pacing aggressively next to his sleek black sedan. The security guards had refused to open the main gate until the police finished taking their incident report, leaving him entirely trapped on my property. The normally stoic, untouchable venture capitalist was reduced to a frantic, red-faced mess. He was screaming into his cell phone, his free hand wildly gesturing in the air as he frantically tried to reach his corporate attorneys on a holiday night. I could see his shoulders trembling under his expensive cashmere sweater. The reality that his own firm, Vanguard Equity, was now hopelessly entangled in a massive federal wire fraud investigation was finally breaking him. His pristine reputation was gone, and the catastrophic financial ruin of his company was staring him right in the face. He leaned against the hood of his car and buried his face in his hand, his body shaking with what looked like absolute terror. Further down the driveway, completely illuminated by the harsh glare of a police spotlight, Trey and Amber were tearing each other apart. Amber had her arms wrapped protectively around her shivering children, her face contorted in absolute rage. Even through the thick, double-paned glass of my living room windows, I could hear the piercing pitch of her voice echoing in the crisp night air. She was jabbing her manicured finger violently into Trey's chest, shoving him backwards step by step toward the frozen rose bushes. Backed into a corner and stripped of all his unearned confidence, Trey finally snapped. He threw his hands up in the air and screamed right back at her, his face twisted in ugly desperation. I watched him hurl the ultimate threat, a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control over a woman who had only ever loved his bank account. He demanded a divorce. He pointed at the gates and shouted that she was a parasite who only cared about his phantom money, threatening to leave her with nothing. It was the most foolish display of weakness I had ever seen. Amber did not flinch. Instead, she laughed right in his face, a harsh, manic laugh that carried clearly across the frozen lawn. She screamed back that she would be filing the papers on Monday morning, that she was taking full custody of the children, and that she would ensure he rotted in federal prison alone. She then grabbed her kids by the hands and marched toward a waiting Uber that had just pulled up outside the security gate, leaving Trey standing entirely alone in the freezing cold, his mouth hanging open in shock. My parents were huddled near the edge of the driveway, looking like two lost, fragile strangers. Diane was clutching her expensive coat tightly around her shoulders, sobbing uncontrollably. The elegant, domineering matriarch who had spent her entire life orchestrating perfect country club gatherings was now weeping openly in front of armed police officers and hired guards. She realized that by blindly backing Trey, she had lost absolutely everything. Her carefully cultivated social standing, her pristine public image, and the illusion of her perfect family were all reduced to ash under the flashing police lights. My father stood next to her, staring blankly at the gravel. He looked completely defeated, a hollow shell of the man who used to dictate the harsh rules of my childhood. The impending bankruptcy of their golden boy meant their own financial destruction. They had poured everything into his failing investment firm, and now it was all gone. Trey stumbled away from the spot where his wife had abandoned him and turned toward our parents. He threw his arms wide open, demanding comfort, demanding a solution, demanding to be saved one last time. But for the very first time in his entire life, my parents did not rush forward to shield him. Diane physically turned her back on him, burying her weeping face in her hands. My father just shook his head slowly, refusing to even look at his son. The rejection was absolute. The unbreakable bond of the Golden family shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the frozen asphalt. They were destroying each other, consumed by their own greed and lies. I stood in the dark watching the final act of this tragedy play out. There was no sadness in my heart. There was no guilt. There was only a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The toxic cycle was finally broken. I reached out, grabbed the edge of the heavy velvet curtains, and pulled them shut, blocking out the flashing lights and closing the door on my past forever. 3 weeks later, the profound silence in my home remained my absolute favorite luxury. The frantic flashing lights of that Thanksgiving night felt like a distant, chaotic nightmare, entirely disconnected from the reality I was now building. Business, as they say, moved on at the speed of light. My Delaware C Corp Sienna Holdings barely registered a blip on its financial radar following the termination of my brother's empty shell vendor contract. I had anticipated the disruption the moment I suspected Trey was snooping around my home office months ago. Within 48 hours of kicking him off my property, my attorneys activated a contingency contract with a massive state-of-the-art logistics facility in Pennsylvania. They seamlessly absorbed the inventory production, bringing on a highly trained permanent workforce that immediately optimized our entire supply chain. The highly publicized Sephora distribution launch happened exactly on schedule. The beauty magazines praised the brand's flawless execution and our commitment to sustainable packaging, completely unaware of the multi-million-dollar corporate war that had taken place right behind the curtain. Our fourth quarter profits surged by 40%. While my empire expanded, the illusion my family had so desperately clung to spectacularly imploded. The fallout was swift, highly public, and absolutely brutal. By the second week of December, Vanguard Equity officially called in the $6 million loan. Since the LLC was entirely hollow, holding absolutely no capital or assets, the private equity firm immediately went after the personal guarantees. Trey and Amber filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy less than 4 days later. Their sprawling, custom-built mansion was seized by the bank, and their luxury cars were unceremoniously towed from the driveway in broad daylight, while their neighbors watched from their perfectly manicured lawns. True to her word on my freezing driveway, Amber filed for an emergency divorce. She took full custody of the children and relocated to a small rental apartment across town, aggressively severing all ties with the man who had ruined her life and destroyed her social standing. But bankruptcy was the absolute least of Trey's problems. The dossier my corporate attorneys handed over to the authorities triggered an unstoppable legal avalanche. Trey was formally indicted on federal charges of wire fraud, forgery, and identity theft. He was currently out on bail awaiting trial and facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. And he was not going down alone. Richard, the arrogant architect of the hostile takeover attempt, found himself caught in the exact trap he helped build. The SEC, tipped off by the fraudulent collateral documents Trey submitted, launched a full-scale investigation into Vanguard Equity. Federal agents raided Richard's corner office in the financial district, seizing his hard drives and freezing his corporate assets under suspicion of systemic bank fraud. The untouchable venture capitalist was suddenly fighting for his own freedom. His pristine reputation was instantly reduced to a cautionary tale, and his elite country club quietly revoked his membership to avoid the scandal. With Trey facing prison and Richard fighting federal indictments, my parents were left standing in the smoking crater of their own greed. They had liquidated a significant portion of their retirement portfolios to bail Trey out of his initial embezzlement scandal, leaving them dangerously exposed. When the bank seized his assets, their money vanished right along with his. The financial safety net they had always assumed I would provide was permanently gone. They were facing their twilight years with a fraction of their wealth and the crushing realization that they had sacrificed their only successful child for a criminal. That sudden, terrifying reality sparked a relentless campaign of desperation. Every single morning, when I sat at my kitchen island with my coffee, my blocked caller log was flooded with notifications. Diane and my father left dozens of sprawling, tearful voicemails. Sometimes Diane was weeping uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness, claiming she had been blinded by a mother's love for her troubled son, and asking me to just come home so we could heal. Sometimes my father was bargaining, suggesting we sit down with a mediator to hash out a fair financial settlement for the family, still absurdly believing he had leverage. They invoked God, they invoked blood, they invoked memories of a childhood that we all knew was a miserable, abusive lie. They even tried sending handwritten letters through my corporate lawyers, demanding I remember my duty to my family. I never listened to a single voicemail. I never opened a single letter. I simply highlighted the list of blocked digital notifications, tapped the delete button, and watched their desperate pleas vanish into the void. I instructed my legal team to return all mail stamped "Return to Sender." The boundary I established on Thanksgiving was not a temporary punishment designed to teach them a lesson. It was a permanent, impenetrable wall. I had spent 28 years trying to earn a place at a table where I was actively despised. Now I owned the entire estate, the table, and the feast. I stood up, poured the rest of my coffee into my travel mug, and grabbed my keys. It was a crisp, bright winter morning, and I had a multi-million-dollar empire to run entirely free from the shadows of the people who never believed I could build one. That crisp winter morning set the tone for the rest of the year. By the time the final week of December arrived, my estate had been completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had poisoned the dining room on Thanksgiving was entirely gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine-roasted chestnuts and genuine, uninhibited laughter. I was hosting my first annual Christmas Eve gala, and for the very first time in my life, I was actually looking forward to a holiday dinner. I walked through the grand foyer, the same space where my parents had tearfully scrambled for their coats, under the glare of police lights just a month prior. Tonight, the marble floors echoed with the cheerful chatter of 50 guests. But this was not a gathering of blood relatives bound by toxic obligations. This was my chosen family. I stood near the edge of the living room nursing a glass of sparkling cider and watched the people who truly mattered. Over by the roaring fireplace, my lead organic chemist Sarah was animatedly explaining a new peptide extraction method to my college business law professor. He was the one who had first handed me a book on corporate structures 10 years ago when I was a desperate teenager looking for a lifeline. Across the room, my new logistics director was sharing a joke with the marketing team, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to the cutthroat, backstabbing environment Trey had cultivated at his failing investment firm. These were the people who had stayed late in the cramped, poorly ventilated laboratory during the early days of Sienna Botanicals. These were the mentors who had answered my panicked phone calls at 2 a.m. when I was trying to navigate my first major retail contract. They were the friends who celebrated my victories without a single ounce of jealousy and supported me through the setbacks without a whisper of judgment. We had built an empire together, brick by brick, formula by formula, built on a foundation of mutual respect and absolute trust. A gentle clinking of a spoon against crystal drew my attention to the center of the room. Sarah raised her champagne glass, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. She did not offer a forced, passive-aggressive toast about family duty, like my mother always did. Instead, she spoke about resilience. She toasted to the late nights, the impossible deadlines, and the unwavering vision that had brought us all to this beautiful home. When she raised her glass to me, calling me the bravest CEO she had ever known, the room erupted into thunderous, heartfelt applause. I felt a sudden, overwhelming warmth bloom in my chest. It was a sensation I had never experienced during any holiday spent with my biological family. I excused myself from the crowd, stepping quietly into the adjoining library and closing the heavy oak doors behind me. The sudden quiet offered a moment of profound clarity. I walked over to the tall windows and looked out at the frost-covered driveway. The spot where my family had violently imploded was now lined with the cars of people who actually valued me. For 28 years, I had carried an invisible, crushing weight on my shoulders. I had contorted myself into endless shapes, trying to be the perfect, compliant daughter, hoping that one day my parents would look at me with the same blind adoration they reserved for Trey. I had internalized their constant criticism, mistaking their cruelty for normal family dynamics. But shedding that toxic weight had fundamentally altered my existence. I realized standing there in the quiet elegance of my library that I could finally breathe. I was no longer waiting for the next insult, the next demand for money, the next manipulative guilt trip. My posture was straighter. My mind was clearer. The lingering anxiety that used to paralyze me every time my phone rang had completely evaporated. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Blood simply dictates who brought you into this world. It does not dictate who belongs in your life. Real family is not an automatic birthright that grants people the permission to abuse you, use you, and discard you when you are no longer convenient. Real family is an active daily choice. It is the people who actively defend your peace, who celebrate your independence, and who love you for exactly who you are, not for what they can extract from you. I took a deep breath, the clean winter air filling my lungs, and turned away from the window. The past was permanently locked outside those gates, freezing in the dark. I opened the library doors and stepped back into the warm light, ready to celebrate the beautiful, unbreakable family I had chosen for myself. The rest of the evening blurred into a beautiful montage of laughter, clinking glasses, and genuine connection. By the time the final guest hugged me goodbye and the heavy front doors closed, it was well past midnight. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a warm, comforting silence. I walked back into the living room, kicked off my heels, and sank into the plush velvet armchair near the dying embers of the fireplace. The glowing coals provided the perfect backdrop for my final reflections on the chaotic storm I had just weathered. People often misunderstand the true nature of vengeance. Pop culture conditions us to believe that revenge must be a loud, violently dramatic spectacle. We picture screaming matches, throwing punches, or actively destroying someone else's life. But that kind of vengeance is inherently flawed. It requires you to lower yourself to the level of your abusers. It keeps your energy firmly tethered to the very people who hurt you, draining your spirit long after the initial conflict is over. I learned over the past 10 years that the most effective, most devastating form of revenge is entirely silent. It is structural. True revenge is simply stepping aside and allowing arrogant people to sign their own destruction, using the pen of their own bottomless greed. Trey and Richard did not lose their mansions, their reputations, and their freedom because I actively plotted to ruin them. I simply built an impenetrable fortress around my hard work and refused to be their sacrificial lamb. I stopped catching them when they fell. Their monumental entitlement was their ultimate undoing. They looked at me and saw a vulnerable, inferior woman running a little skincare hobby. Their staggering hubris completely blinded them to the legal landmines they were gleefully tap dancing upon. When you deal with narcissists and lifelong parasites, you do not need to orchestrate their downfall. You just need to meticulously document their actions, secure your borders, and let the unforgiving law of natural consequences take the wheel. There was, however, one final lingering loose end I needed to tie up. A microscopic detail, but a profoundly symbolic one, required to close this chapter forever. Years ago, before the Delaware C Corp, before the Sephora contracts, and before the multi-million-dollar valuations, I had a brief moment of financial vulnerability. I needed capital to secure my first bulk order of botanical ingredients. I made the mistake of asking my family for a standard business loan. My parents laughed at me, but Richard, always eager to play the benevolent patriarch, handed me a check for $5,000. He made sure to do it publicly, loudly, calling it pity money. He explicitly framed it as a charitable donation to keep me from embarrassing the family name. He never asked for equity, writing it off as the cheap cost of maintaining his superiority complex. He had undoubtedly forgotten all about that minor transaction. But I never forgot. I kept my internal ledger perfectly balanced. The week after Trey's federal indictment became public knowledge, I took a trip to my private bank. I sat across from my wealth manager and requested a certified cashier's check made out to Richard for exactly $5,000. I brought the crisp, watermarked check back to my home office. I slipped it inside a heavy white envelope. I did not include a letter detailing my success or rubbing salt in his fresh wounds. I simply took a piece of premium cardstock and wrote 3 words in sharp black ink: paid in full. I did not put a return address on the envelope. I paid a private courier to hand-deliver it directly to the cramped temporary rental office Richard was forced to operate out of after federal agents seized his luxurious headquarters. I did not need to see his face when he opened it. The mental image was satisfying enough. A once untouchable financial titan drowning in federal bank fraud investigations and watching his legacy evaporate, receiving a perfectly legal, utterly dismissive refund from the woman he tried to destroy. Handing it back was never about the money. It was about cleanly severing the very last string they believed they had attached to my life. It was the ultimate declaration of my absolute independence. As the final embers fade to ash, I look around the expansive, peaceful space of my home. The trauma of being the family scapegoat is a ghost story I no longer have to tell. I am the sole architect of my reality now. For anyone out there who feels trapped under the toxic weight of family expectations, remember this absolute truth. You do not owe your future to people who only value you for what they can extract. Build your fortress in total silence, protect your peace fiercely, and let their own arrogance be the architect of their final undoing. Now, I want to turn this conversation over to you. Sitting here sharing my story has not just been about exposing the toxic dynamics of my past or reliving a dramatic Thanksgiving dinner. It has been about reaching out to anyone who might be sitting at their own version of that table right now, feeling completely trapped, chronically undervalued, and hopelessly alone. I know exactly how heavy that isolation feels in your chest. I know the paralyzing fear of thinking that if you finally stand up for yourself, you will lose the only family you have ever known. But as you have seen from the trajectory of my life, sometimes losing that toxic, draining connection is the exact catalyst you need to finally find yourself. So I want to ask you a very important question. Have you ever let someone's greed become their own trap? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where simply holding your ground and refusing to play the helpless victim allowed a manipulator to expose their true colors to the world? It takes an incredible amount of restraint to stay silent when you are being unjustly attacked. It takes immense emotional discipline to not scream your truth from the rooftops when people are actively plotting against your success. But there is a profound, undeniable power in stepping back, securing your boundaries, and letting their own reckless entitlement do all the heavy lifting. If you have ever experienced that quiet, definitive victory, I want to read about it. Or perhaps your story resonates more with the painful reality of having to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you. Cutting ties with your biological family is never a decision made lightly, no matter how justified it is. Society constantly pressures us to forgive and forget, bombarding us with the toxic narrative that blood is always thicker than water. But nobody talks about the profound grief of mourning the parents or siblings you deserved long before you actually cut them out of your life. Walking away requires you to mourn the illusion of a family that never truly existed. It is a heartbreaking, exhausting process, but it is also the most liberating step you can ever take toward your own healing. If you have had to make that agonizing choice, if you have had to pack your bags and leave behind the people who should have been your safest harbor, please share your experience in the comments below. Your stories matter more than you know. When you write them out, you are not just venting into a digital void. You are building a community. You are showing someone else who is currently scrolling through these comments in the middle of a sleepless, anxiety-filled night that they are not crazy, they are not broken, and they are absolutely not alone. Being labeled the black sheep of the family is rarely about you doing something wrong. It is almost always about you seeing through the dysfunction and refusing to play your assigned role. The comment section of this video is a safe space for the scapegoats, the black sheep, and the cycle breakers. We are the ones who refuse to inherit the generational trauma, and we are the ones who are building healthier, happier lives on our own terms. If this journey resonated with you, if you found any strength, validation, or comfort in my words today, please hit the like button. It helps push this message out to a wider audience, reaching the people who might desperately need a reminder of their own power right now. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue having these honest, unfiltered conversations about boundary setting, overcoming narcissistic family abuse, and building absolute financial and emotional independence. I have so many more insights, business strategies, and personal lessons to share with you all. And please share this video with a friend, a coworker, or anyone you know who might be struggling with a toxic dynamic. Sometimes simply hearing that someone else survived the exact same nightmare is the key that unlocks the door to their own freedom. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Thank you for listening to my truth, and thank you for being part of this incredible, growing, chosen family. Remember that your worth is not defined by the people who are biologically incapable of seeing it. Your value is not determined by how much you can sacrifice for those who refuse to appreciate you. You are entirely whole, entirely capable, and entirely deserving of a life filled with genuine respect and unconditional support. Keep building your fortress. Keep guarding your energy. Never apologize for protecting your peace, and never let anyone convince you to lower your drawbridge for a wolf in sheep's clothing. Stay strong, trust your intuition, and I will see you all in the next video.